Hello there, and welcome back to Sleepvestor, where money steps out of its hard outer shell and becomes a quieter thing, almost like a soft wind moving through tall grass. Here, ideas slow down, thoughts stretch gently, and the world of dollars and decisions feels less like a tangle of numbers and more like a story you can walk through at your own pace. Let the space around you calm for a moment. Breathe in, as if drawing in warm light. Breathe out, as if setting down a weight you no longer need to hold. There is no rush here, no pressure, only quiet curiosity and the steady hum of your own awareness. Tonight we wander into the strange territory of how humans relate to losing things, especially money. It's a feeling so deep in the mind that it works long before words arrive, long before logic steps onto the stage. You might think of it as an instinct leftover from a world where survival depended on guarding whatever you managed to gather. Even now, in modern life, this feeling hides beneath every choice, shaping your behavior in small, almost invisible ways. If you enjoy this kind of gentle exploration, you're welcome to subscribe, lightly, like setting a small lantern in a window to guide you back whenever you want to return. Now let's step into the story. Imagine someone offering you $20. Nothing complicated, just a small gift, easy to accept, maybe pleasant in a simple way. Now imagine someone offering you the exact same 20, but only if you agree to risk losing 10. Suddenly your mind sharpens, your shoulders stiffen. The idea feels heavier, uneasy, as if someone dimmed the lights or moved the floor just slightly under your feet. It's the same money, the same numbers, the same math, yet the emotional weight is completely different. This is one of the mind's oldest tricks. Losing something stings far more than gaining something delights. A small loss echoes louder than a larger win. Even when the outcome is clearly better overall, the possibility of losing even a little can make the whole moment feel wobbly. To understand this better, picture fear of loss as a small companion walking beside you. It wears a cloak stitched from memories. The time you ran out of money, the time something broke, the time you regretted a purchase, the time you wished you had saved more. It carries a lantern that glows brightly at the sight of danger. But this lantern is peculiar. It only illuminates what could go wrong. It doesn't shine on what might go right. This companion is not your enemy. It tries its best to guard you. It wants you safe, fed, housed, comfortable. But sometimes it overreacts, tugging at your sleeve when you're standing on perfectly solid ground. To see how powerful this feeling can be, imagine a coastal village from long ago. The people there were skilled fishermen who sailed every morning into open water. At sunset, they returned with nets full of shimmering fish. In the center of that village stood a market where no coins were used. Instead, each person carried a pouch of smooth stones from the sea. These stones weren't just stones. Each one represented a memory of the work done to earn it. A long day at sea, a storm overcome, a lucky catch during lean times. Parting with a stone felt like parting with a piece of personal history. Over time, the villagers became so protective of their stones that the market nearly froze. People wandered through it with tense shoulders and worried eyes, clutching their pouches close. A fisherman might desperately need a new net, but the cost of giving up even one stone felt unbearable. A mother might need bread, but the idea of parting with a stone filled her with dread. The market became a place of hesitation, not exchange. One afternoon, the village elder stepped into that stillness. Her hair was silver like the scales of the fish the boats brought home. She looked around at the silent stalls and said, in a voice soft enough to soothe but firm enough to be heard, "You're holding your stones so tightly that nothing can move. You fear losing them so much that you're losing, what they could bring you. Her words floated into the hush like a pebble dropped into a tidal pool. No one argued. They simply stood quietly, listening to the truth settling in their chests. As the sun set over the water that night, the villagers began to realize how deeply fear had wrapped around their choices. Nothing was growing, repairing, improving, or sharing because everyone was guarding what they had with clenched fists. The market had become a mirror of the mind, a place where the fear of losing overshadowed the hope of gaining. You may have felt something like that in your own life. Maybe you kept money in cash even though you wanted to invest. Maybe you held on to something you bought but never used, telling yourself it would be a waste to let it go. Maybe you hesitated to take a risk that could have helped you grow. Fear doesn't need to be dramatic to be powerful. Sometimes it simply leans in and whispers, "Not yet," or "Be careful," or "You might regret this." There's a name for this pattern: loss aversion. The human mind reacts almost twice as strongly to the possibility of losing as it does to the possibility of gaining. It's a wiring built for ancient survival, where losing food or shelter meant real danger. Today, it still pulses through your choices, even when the stakes are much gentler. Take a moment now to picture a quiet place. Maybe a meadow where the grass moves like breath. Maybe a dim room with warm light on the walls. Maybe a shoreline where small waves curl against the sand. In front of you, scattered like tiny memories, imagine the financial choices you've made across your life. Some light, some heavy, some joyful, some a little sharp at the edges. Which choices did you hold on to longer than you needed to, simply because letting go felt like losing? Which ones slipped away from you, and what did those moments teach you? Which ones still linger in your mind, asking for a bit of your attention even now? You don't have to answer. Just noticing them is enough. The act of noticing has a way of loosening old knots and letting fresh understanding rise to the surface, quietly, like air bubbles drifting up from the deep. This is where we pause for now, letting the ideas settle in the mind like silt settling in a calm river. The story continues naturally, without hurry, like a path unfolding beneath slow footsteps. The mind has a way of turning every financial choice into a landscape, even if you don't realize it. Some decisions feel like wide, sunlit fields where the path is obvious and safe. Others resemble thick forests with brambles, shadows, and the feeling that something unseen might be waiting behind the trees. Most people walk these landscapes on instinct, rarely noticing the way emotions tug them left or right. But sometimes a person becomes aware of the terrain beneath their feet. Elian was such a person. He lived in a valley surrounded by hills that shimmered faintly at night, as if each hill remembered the footsteps of past generations. People in the valley often spoke of choices as if they were paths in those glowing hills. Some paths glowed gold, warm and inviting. Others glowed pale blue, uncertain but intriguing. And some were dim and narrow, with a subtle pull that kept people walking them long after the path had stopped leading anywhere useful. Elian was not wealthy, but he carried something better: curiosity. A soft, persistent urge to understand why he felt fear rise in his chest whenever he had to make an important financial decision. He noticed how his hands tightened when he had to spend money, even when the purchase made sense. He noticed how he held on to old tools he no longer needed, because it felt wrong to part with something he once worked hard to earn. He noticed how a tiny risk could loom in his thoughts like a storm cloud, growing larger the more he looked at it. One evening, after finishing a day of long, steady work, Elian stepped outside. The air was cool, brushed with the scent of rain that hadn't fallen yet. In the distance, the hills shimmered faintly, as they did every night. But this time something felt different. The glow seemed clearer, almost like an invitation. Elian felt a tug, gentle but certain, urging him to walk toward the hills. He followed that feeling, moving through quiet fields where insects sang softly in the tall grass. As he reached the base of the nearest hill, a faint path appeared beneath his feet, glowing with a soft, gold hue. He stepped onto it, and the world grew quieter still, as if even the wind wanted to listen. The path did not lead him upward. Instead, it curved inward, guiding him toward a grove of tall trees with silver leaves. The leaves shimmered with every small breath of breeze, creating the sound of coins brushing against one another. In the center of the grove stood an old structure, almost like a small open temple. Inside, sitting on a carved stone bench, was an elderly figure wrapped in a robe the color of warm earth. Her eyes were gentle but sharp, as if she could see not only the person before her, but also all the thoughts he carried. "You've come a long way to meet something you already know," she said. Elian hesitated. "I don't think I understand." "It's not understanding you're after," she replied. "It's permission. Permission to see your fear without letting it control your steps." The words settled in him like smooth stones. The elder patted the bench beside her, and Elian sat. "Tell me," she said, "when you have something valuable, what is the first feeling that rises inside you?" Elian sighed. "That I might lose it." She nodded. "And when you think of gaining something new?" "It feels good," he said, "but not as strong, not as loud." "Of course," she said. "The mind is an echo chamber for old dangers. Long ago, losing food meant hunger. Losing shelter meant cold. Your ancestors carried that memory in their bones. And now you carry it, even when the danger is different." She extended her hand, and a small sphere of light appeared above her palm. Inside it, tiny scenes flickered. A person hesitating to invest, another clinging to a failing business, another keeping a broken object because it once cost money. Each scene glimmered briefly before dissolving into soft light. "Fear of loss," she said, "is not a monster. It is a storyteller, but its stories are too dramatic, too heavy. It always imagines the worst ending." Elian watched the glowing sphere closely. In each scene, the person suffered not from losing, but from clinging too tightly. "But how do I change that?" Elian asked. "The fear feels so real, like something pressing against my chest." The elder closed her hand, letting the sphere fade. "You do not silence fear," she said. "You walk beside it. You let it speak, but you do not let it choose the path." She motioned toward the glowing ground beneath them. "This place shows you choices as they truly are, not as your emotions paint them. When you see fear clearly, it softens. It becomes smaller. It stops trying to lead you." The silver leaves rustled, filling the grove with a sound like gentle rain. Elian breathed deeply, feeling something inside him loosen, just a little. The elder studied him for a moment, then said, "When you return home, you'll notice moments when fear whispers to you. Listen to it, but ask questions too. Does the whisper protect you? Or does it limit you? Is the danger real? Or is it simply familiar?" Her voice grew quieter, like a candle dimming with dusk. "Awareness is the first step. Once you see the pattern, it cannot hide again." Elian watched the shimmering leaves. They shifted in color, catching the faint moonlight that filtered into the grove. He thought about all the times he hesitated in his life, all the times he clung to something simply because he feared feeling the sting of loss. He imagined the fear as a small companion, not threatening, but anxious, trying too hard to be helpful. A soft breeze moved through the grove, carrying the scent of earth and distant water. The elder's presence felt steady beside him, like a warm lantern held in the dark. Slowly, the path beneath his feet brightened again, urging him to stand. He rose, feeling a quiet steadiness settle inside him, as if a knot had loosened somewhere deep in his thoughts. He turned to the elder, but she only nodded, as if she already knew what he would say. The grove seemed to shimmer with stillness, a reminder that some lessons don't need dramatic endings. They simply need to be absorbed. Elian stepped away from the grove and began walking back toward the valley. The ground glowed faintly beneath his steps, guiding him. The night felt different now. The hills seemed less mysterious, less intimidating, and the quiet feeling he carried was neither excitement nor fear, but something softer, something like understanding. The path stretched ahead of him, steady and patient, waiting for his next step. Elian reached the edge of the valley and paused, not because the scenery demanded attention, but because something in him felt rearranged. The conversation with the elder stayed with him, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet shift in how his thoughts lined up. It was the kind of shift that makes a person reconsider habits they've repeated for years without question. He continued home along a familiar path. Villagers were finishing their day, tools being stored, chairs being pulled inside, brief greetings exchanged. Nothing unusual. Yet Elian felt a new sharpness in how he noticed things. It wasn't the world that had changed. It was the framework inside his own mind. When he stepped into his cottage, he set his belongings aside and looked around. The space was simple and practical. Nothing shimmered, nothing glowed, but every object in the room carried a memory. His attention fell on an old fishing net tucked neatly in a corner. He hadn't fished in years, yet something made him hold on to it. He wasn't sentimental about most things, so he asked himself why this one object stayed. He picked it up and realized the answer came easily. He remembered the effort it had taken to repair it years ago. Long hours of tying knots, patching holes, straightening lines. The net represented work, and in a way, he felt obligated to keep it, as though discarding it would erase that old effort. He set it down again and recognized the pattern. It wasn't about the net. It was about the weight he gave to past labor. If something required sweat and time, he assumed it must still have value. It felt wrong to release it, even when it no longer served him. The discomfort was small but persistent, like a stitch tugging at his side. At his table, he emptied his small pouch of coins, placing each one into a careful row. He noticed the same pattern there. Coins earned through difficult jobs felt special. He hesitated to spend them, even when he needed to. Coins earned through easier work seemed simpler to part with. Seeing the difference laid out in front of him made the situation feel almost mathematical. Same currency, different emotions. The numbers didn't justify the hesitation. The feelings did. And the feelings came from the same place the elder had spoken about. Fear of loss attaching itself to the effort of the past. He leaned back in his chair and thought about others in the village. The neighbor who refused to sell his aging cart because he had repaired it so many times it felt like an extension of himself. The shopkeeper who kept pouring money into a failing store because she had sacrificed so much to open it in the first place. The builder who continued a project long after it made sense because he had already put too much into it. He saw their decisions clearly for what they were, emotional loyalty to sunk costs. Yet he had never recognized the same pattern in his own life until this moment. He stepped outside for a moment of fresh perspective, not needing scenery or stillness, just a pause from the confines of the room. He walked a short path while turning over a memory from childhood. A story his father told about a merchant who continued a failing venture simply because he had invested too much to stop. At the time, it had sounded like a moral tale about stubbornness. But looking back, Elian recognized something deeper. The merchant wasn't chasing success. He was chasing the feeling of not wanting to admit loss. Elian could suddenly list a dozen times where he had done something similar. Decisions he clung to out of principle rather than logic. Money he kept in places that felt safe, but made no progress. Tools he held onto because he had once cared about them fiercely. Ideas he refused to adjust because he had defended them before. He realized that fear of loss wasn't just about money. It shaped dignity, identity, pride, and memory. It didn't just whisper, "Don't spend," or "Don't risk." It whispered, "Don't let go of who you were when you earned this." The understanding landed with a quiet sort of force. The fear wasn't trying to sabotage him. It was trying to preserve his history. But history isn't always the best guide for the future. He sat on a low stone along the path and let the thought sit with him. Not drifting, not meditating, simply thinking with more clarity than he usually afforded himself. He imagined the familiar companion inside him, the one wrapped in old memories and old efforts. It wasn't scolding him anymore. It wasn't tugging at his sleeve. It simply sat beside him, waiting to see what he would choose next. He thought, not aloud but clearly, "I understand why you hold on so tightly, but I decide where I go next." It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Something simply aligned inside him. A knot loosened, a threshold crossed. After a while, he returned to his home with an ease that felt unusual and honest. He didn't feel transformed. He felt more awake. And perhaps that was the change that mattered most. Elian woke the next day with a clearer mind than usual. Nothing dramatic had happened overnight, yet something in him moved with a different kind of organization, like a drawer that finally closed properly after years of sticking. He went about his morning routine the way he always did, but he noticed how decisions arose in his thoughts. Small, everyday choices that once felt automatic now carried a trace of awareness. He took out the fishing net again. Last night, it had represented a realization. This morning, it represented a choice. The difference mattered. He wasn't trying to fix his habits or overturn his past. He simply wanted to choose with intention rather than fear. He folded the net once, twice, and set it aside for someone who could use it. There was no surge of emotion, no sentimental moment, just a clean decision, a removal of weight he no longer needed to carry. At his table, he went through his records with the same clarity. Instead of treating certain coins as sacred because they represented old effort, he looked at them for what they were, units of possibility. The past that had produced them was already complete. The future those coins could influence was still unset. The usefulness lay ahead, not behind. He wasn't trying to defeat loss aversion. He wasn't trying to erase the instinct. He was simply recognizing the way it shaped his decisions so he could decide whether it deserved that influence. That alone made the fear quieter. As the day went on, he spoke with neighbors and acquaintances, noticing how often people justified a choice with references to the past. "I've spent too much on this to stop now. I can't abandon it after everything I've put into it. If I walk away, all the effort will be wasted." He heard these phrases with new ears. They were not statements of strategy. They were statements of attachment. People weren't defending the logic of their decisions. They were defending their history, their pride, their identity. It struck him how rarely people allowed themselves to pivot, even when the benefit of pivoting was obvious. At one point, an older man approached him, complaining about repairs he'd been making to the same equipment for years. He described the frustration, the cost, the exhaustion. Elian asked, "Why not replace it?" The man frowned, as if the idea was strange. "Because I've kept it going this long," he said, almost offended by the simplicity of the question. Elian didn't argue. He just listened, recognizing the pattern. The equipment was no longer the issue. The issue was the story the man had attached to it. A story built on years of labor and a sense of identity. Letting go felt like canceling the effort already spent. Elian understood that feeling now with more precision. It wasn't foolishness. It wasn't stubbornness. It was a psychological reflex, a deep discomfort at the idea of letting something die before it pays off. People wanted their past work to be validated by future success. Cutting losses felt like admitting defeat. By afternoon, Elian returned home with an unusual sense of steadiness. He took out a blank page and wrote down decisions he had been postponing for months. Things small and large. Things he kept promising he would handle later. Instead of organizing them by urgency or importance, he organized them by the emotions tied to them. Which ones felt heavy because of fear? Which ones felt tangled because of pride? Which ones felt difficult because they challenged old beliefs about money? The list surprised him. He realized that many of the decisions he had labeled as complicated were simply emotionally uncomfortable. The complexity was an illusion. The resistance came from old instincts being triggered. He went down the list and one by one examined each choice without rushing. He asked himself 3 questions for every entry. Does this help me now? Does this hold me back? Am I keeping it because it's useful or because I'm afraid to lose it? The answers were not always easy, but they were clear. And clarity, he realized, had its own quiet kind of relief. As he continued reflecting, something else became obvious. Fear of loss had never been the true antagonist. It had protected him in ways he rarely acknowledged. It kept him from impulsive decisions. It encouraged caution. It helped him value stability. The issue wasn't the presence of fear. It was the imbalance. When fear spoke louder than reason, that's when he drifted off course. There was a moment where he leaned back in his chair and thought about the countless people who made financial decisions driven by this invisible pull. Panic selling, oversaving to the point of missing opportunities, staying in unproductive jobs or businesses, clinging to items, investments, or habits long past their usefulness. He saw the pattern with a clarity that felt almost academic. People were not making choices based on value. They were making choices based on the emotional weight of losing something. He realized how often society interpreted these behaviors as personality flaws or poor discipline, when in truth, they were rooted in ancient survival logic. People weren't irrational, they were protective. They didn't fear the loss of the object or money itself. They feared the feeling associated with the loss, the sting of regret, the discomfort of uncertainty, the worry that they would blame themselves afterward. This insight changed the way he viewed both himself and others. Judgment softened. Understanding deepened. Awareness grew. Later in the evening, he stepped outside, not for scenery, not for a mood shift, just for space to think without walls around him. He reflected on the small companion inside him, the one who once shouted warnings about any possible loss. It was still there, but different now. Instead of pulling him backward, it seemed to simply walk with him, offering its concern as information rather than command. He imagined saying, "I hear you, but I choose what happens next." That idea alone felt like the turning point. He went back inside and put away the list he had made. Not because he was finished with it, but because he no longer needed to force himself to face it. The decisions would be made, not under pressure, not in avoidance, just made plainly. The evening settled into its quiet rhythm. He didn't feel a sense of triumph, nor the thrill of transformation. What he felt was something more stable. the grounded confidence that came from understanding his own mind a little better. His final thought before resting was simple and steady. Fear doesn't have to disappear for progress to happen. It just has to stop holding the map. And with that realization, he let the day come to its natural close. Elian woke with the sense that something inside him had rearranged itself in a long, slow way. The kind of adjustment you only notice after it has already settled into place. He didn't rush into the day. He moved as he always did, but with the quiet assurance of someone who now understood a pattern that had been running beneath his choices for years. He stepped outside briefly, not for freshness or beauty, but for plain orientation. The village was already stirring with its usual rhythm. Merchants arranging goods, workers heading toward their fields, people exchanging the same morning words they'd spoken 1,000 times. Nothing appeared different, yet he sensed the shift anyway. His mind felt aligned with the reality that money, effort, and the fear of losing either were not opponents or burdens. They were simply parts of being human. As he walked through the village, he noticed opportunities to test his new insight. A neighbor was trying to sell a stack of tools he no longer needed, but he had priced them far higher than anyone would reasonably pay. When someone asked why, the man shook his head. "These cost me a fortune," he insisted. "I can't let them go for less." Elian recognized the tug beneath those words. The man wasn't valuing the tools. He was valuing the memory of what he paid for them. Elian didn't correct him or lecture. He simply nodded in understanding. The man wasn't stuck because he was greedy. He was stuck because he didn't want to feel the sting of selling something for less than its original worth. The loss felt personal, even though it wasn't. Later, he passed the baker, who was debating throwing out a tray of pastries from the day before. "I could keep them," she murmured, "just in case someone wants them. It took time to make them. I hate wasting effort." She winced as she looked at the stale dough, clearly torn between reason and regret. Elian recognized that tug too. She wasn't trying to save pastries. She was trying to save the feeling of having worked hard. Letting the stale tray go felt like admitting those hours were spent for nothing. He didn't tell her what to do. Instead, he said gently, "Sometimes the value is in what we learned by doing, not in what remains afterward." She exhaled, the tension leaving her shoulders almost invisibly. The tray went to the compost bin without further struggle. He continued walking, realizing how often people carried these emotional costs without knowing their names. When someone hesitated over a purchase, it wasn't just budgeting. When someone clung to old investments, it wasn't just strategy. When someone refused to change course, even when the path no longer served them, it wasn't arrogance. It was the familiar voice inside all people that insisted losses must be avoided at all costs, even when avoiding them created new ones. He saw this more clearly now than he ever had before. At midday, he found a quiet corner near the trading hall and sat with a few coins in his hand. He examined them not as objects, but as reminders of the choices they could enable. They were neither lucky charms nor burdens. They were simply tools that carried whatever meaning he gave them. That was all. As he sat there, another villager approached him. A young woman, anxious, twisting a small wooden charm between her fingers. She explained that she was considering selling a plot of land she had inherited, but she hesitated. "My grandfather worked so hard for this land," she said. "If I sell it, it feels like I'm throwing away everything he did." Elian listened without interrupting. When she finally paused, he said, "Your grandfather worked hard for the life he lived, not for the specific choices you make now. His effort created the opportunities, not the obligations." She stared at him, thinking it through. The tension in her eyes softened. She nodded slowly. Then she walked away, still thinking, but clearer than before. As he watched her go, Elian recognized how much easier it was to see the patterns in others. And yet, the hardest work was recognizing them in himself. He thought back to the old fishing net, the coins he had sorted, the list of decisions he had begun exploring. He felt no guilt about any of it now, only clarity. He understood that loss aversion wasn't a flaw. It was a reflex, and reflexes could be acknowledged, understood, and worked with, not fought against. He glanced toward the small hill overlooking the village. It wasn't symbolic or dramatic. It was simply a place where he often went to think. As he climbed the slope, he reflected on how far the idea had traveled within him. The fear of losing what he had built wasn't something he needed to silence. He just needed to understand why it spoke so loudly. At the top, he sat and considered his next steps. Real ones, financial ones, personal ones. Not grand plans, but genuine decisions shaped by awareness rather than instinct. Choices that recognized both the value of caution and the freedom that comes from letting the past stay where it belongs. He thought about the people who might hear his story someday. People wrestling with their own invisible threads of fear. People who didn't realize how often they clung to things because the idea of letting go felt like betrayal. People who carried old investments, old beliefs, old habits not because they served them, but because they were familiar. He hoped those people might see themselves in some part of his understanding, and perhaps they would feel just enough space inside their minds to question a long-held pattern. Even a small moment of clarity could shift the entire trajectory of someone's finances, their stress, their sense of self. Before he stood up, he reflected on one last thought. Humans often think they fear losing money, opportunities, or status. But what they truly fear is losing the meaning they attach to those things. Money is functional. Meaning is emotional. And it is emotion that usually writes the real rules. Elian headed back down the hill with a steady sense of purpose. Not a grand mission. Not a newfound identity. Simply a readiness to live with greater self-awareness. His relationship with loss wasn't conquered or fixed. It was understood, and that he knew was enough. As evening approached, he settled into his home and allowed the day to close without effort. No dramatic ending, no final flourish. Just a quiet understanding that every choice from here onward would be shaped by a mind that had learned how to see its own reflexes clearly. He closed his eyes with one final thought drifting through his mind, simple but liberating. The story of your money is the story of your emotions. And once you understand the emotion behind each decision, you begin, at last, to write your story on purpose. And in that understanding, the day ended.